So, you think you're tough. You lift weights, drink black coffee, and once spent a whole weekend camping without Wi-Fi. Impressive. But let's be honest, drop you into a Viking winter for even one day, and your carefully curated toughness would melt faster than your overpriced winter parka in a Norse blizzard. Why? Because Viking life wasn't just hard, it was merciless, unfiltered, unheated, unapologetic. This wasn't some fantasy series where everyone has leather armor, cool braids, and dramatic lighting. This was reality, smoky, muddy, and constantly wet. Let's set the scene. It's the dead of winter in 9th century Scandinavia. The sun rises sometime after brunch and sets before you've finished cursing the cold. The wind, it doesn't blow, it bites. It howls through your thatch roof like a wolf with trust issues. The sky is gray, the ground is gray. Your fingers are gray. You've been gray for weeks, but that's fine. You're alive. Probably, as long as the fire doesn't go out, and the goat doesn't freeze, and your neighbor doesn't accidentally steal your last onion. Step inside. If you dare, you shuffle across the icy threshold into your home, a longhouse built from logs, turf, and sheer Nordic defiance. It's warm, sort of, because the fire's going, and the cow is breathing on you. Yes, there's a cow inside. More on that later. Your eyes sting immediately. Why? Because your house is 40% air, 60% smoke. The roof has a hole. It's meant to help. It doesn't. The fire pit in the center is the only thing standing between you and hypothermia. But it also means your lungs are now part of the meat-curing process. You cough, you blink through the haze. You stumble past your grandmother spinning wool and your uncle sharpening an axe with suspicious focus. Everyone is wearing fur, layers of wool, and varying expressions of seasonal despair. Your bedroom. It's called the wall sleeping arrangements are communal. Not because Vikings were big on bonding, but because sharing body heat was non-negotiable. You, your family, your cousin's new wife, a goat, and 2 chickens sleep on a raised wooden platform lining the wall. Straw mattress, animal hide blanket, zero privacy. Hope you're not a light sleeper. If you're lucky, you're the one not sleeping next to the pig. If you're unlucky, you are the pig. And yet, they called this life. This wasn't special. This wasn't survival mode. This was Tuesday. For the Vikings, this wasn't a crisis. It was routine. They weren't heroes. They were humans who learned to outstubborn the weather. And you'd be crying into your sour yogurt by sundown. So you've stepped into a Viking longhouse. It's dark. It's damp. It smells like wet wool, cured meat, and livestock anxiety. And you're about to learn that this is where the real challenge begins. Because Viking houses didn't just shelter you from the cold. They trapped heat, smoke, people, animals, and whatever sanity you had left after 2 weeks of snow and pickled fish. Let's break it down. A longhouse wasn't a home the way you think of it. There were no bedrooms, no kitchen, no living room. It was one big, low-ceilinged rectangle where everything happened at once, made from timber, stacked stone, turf, or whatever else hadn't frozen solid that week. Viking homes were designed with only one priority: don't die. Low ceilings to trap heat, thick walls to block wind, single room to centralize your suffering. No insulation, no double glazing, just walls packed with moss and despair. The fire pit, heart and hazard, in the center of the longhouse sat the fire pit, not a fireplace, a literal pit. This was the life source of the house. It provided heat, light, cooking flames, and a consistent reason to cough for the rest of your life. There were no chimneys, Smoke rose up to the rafters, circled around like it was hunting you, and then settled evenly across your sinuses. By morning, your clothes smelled like smoked ham. By spring, so did your lungs. Light, if you're lucky. There were no windows, unless you count small holes stuffed with animal bladders or translucent horns. The only light came from the fire and maybe a few oil lamps, if your family hadn't used up all the fish fat on soup. Sunlight barely entered, which was fine, because in Viking winter there was no sun. Just hours and hours of chilly gloom and emotionally distant cloud cover. Interior design. Try functional chaos. The Viking home wasn't cluttered. It was overoccupied. One side of the longhouse housed the family. The other side, the livestock. That's right, cows, goats, sheep, chickens, sometimes a horse, and always a smell that lingered longer than your will to live. There might be a thin wooden partition, but you still heard everything. Chewing, mooing, occasional panic, and the sound of a goat stepping on your boots for the third time that week. But hey, animals gave off body heat. And in winter, body heat meant you still had toes. The floor, where dirt meets history. You didn't have floorboards. You had packed earth or frozen mud, depending on the month. It got trampled, smoked, soaked, and sometimes used as a casual storage surface for tools, bones, half-eaten bread, or your cousin's unfinished fishing net. Mats made from straw or reeds were scattered around, mostly for sleeping or stopping toddlers from face-planting into goat poop. You did not remove your shoes, ever. You were lucky if you still had shoes. And yet, it worked. These houses were rough, cramped, loud, dim, but they were also genius in their own brutal way. They preserved heat, sheltered families, stored food, and concentrated survival in one roaring, wheezing box. You wouldn't last an hour in one. The Vikings lived in them for generations. Here's a phrase you didn't expect to hear today. Cuddle up with the cow or freeze to death. But in Viking Scandinavia, that was less advice and more standard winter protocol. Because when the temperature plummeted and the wind started making ghost noises outside your longhouse, you turned to the only thing warmer than a wool cloak and slightly less judgmental than your uncle: livestock. The Viking heating system had hooves. There was no thermostat, no radiator, no heated blankets or miracle space heaters. You had fire in the middle of the room, smoky, flickering, and never quite enough. And you had a small barn full of mammals that doubled as radiators with eyes. Cows, goats, sheep, and even the occasional pig slept inside your longhouse, not just nearby, not outside in a shed. Inside, with you, all night, every night, until spring. The buyer. Welcome to the animal apartment. Usually sectioned off at one end of the longhouse. If the humans lived in rustic simplicity, the animals lived in, well, equal rustic simplicity, just with slightly more drool and less responsibility. But those animals, they gave off a shocking amount of heat. One adult cow puts out enough warmth to mildly roast a Viking foot if you're sitting nearby with a broken sock. Put 2 or 3 cows in a confined space, and suddenly you've got yourself a steamy bovine sauna, one that smells like hay, damp fur, and whatever digestive crimes the animals committed that day. Why bring them inside? It wasn't just about warmth. It was also about keeping them alive. Frostbite kills cows to protecting them from predators. Wolves weren't exactly shy preventing theft, because yes, someone might steal your goat in a blizzard fertilizing the floor. Unintentionally, constantly. and often in your path to the fire. Sounds gross. It was. Let's not romanticize it. You tried to sleep while a chicken perched on the roof beam above your head. A sheep sneezed into your straw bed, and your neighbor's goat made aggressive eye contact with you at 2 a.m. The floor got slippery. The smells were impressive. And if one of the pigs had stomach issues, well, good luck finding dry hay in the morning. But it kept you alive. Animal heat wasn't just useful, it was essential. In the worst months, when the fire burned low and the wind found its way through every crack in the walls, you curled up next to a breathing, snorting, farting pile of warmth and thanked the gods it wasn't your cousin. Because Viking central heating wasn't electric. It was organic, domestic, and occasionally made weird noises in its sleep. You're exhausted. Your hands are cracked from chopping firewood. Your nose has been running since September, and your only meal today was a stew that might have included bark. All you want now is sleep, rest, peace. Too bad. You live in a Viking longhouse, and sleep isn't peace. It's a tactical group survival exercise. Beds? You mean the platforms. Let's start with the basics. There were no bedrooms, no privacy, and definitely no, can I just sleep in the guest room? Everyone slept together on raised wooden platforms built along the sides of the longhouse walls. Why raised? To stay off the freezing floor. Why wouldn't? Because even the Vikings weren't sleeping directly on frozen dirt if they could help it. These sleeping platforms were wide enough to fit multiple people, like your entire family, some extended relatives, and occasionally someone you didn't know that well but needed warmth. The great Viking sleep pile. Imagine climbing into a shared bed with your parents, 2 siblings, your widowed aunt, a stranger passing through town, and a sheep with attitude. You slept in your clothes, under layers of hides, and next to people who all snored in different rhythms. If someone got up to use the night bucket, you noticed, because they stepped on your leg, apologized in Old Norse, and tripped over the goat. No pajamas. Just layers. You didn't change for bed. You added more layers. Wool, tunic, cloak, sheepskin vest, possibly a second pair of socks if you were rich or smart. And yes, you kept your boots on, because nothing wakes you up faster than stepping barefoot into a puddle of livestock. Surprise, at 3 a.m. Babies in bundles, elders in corners, infants were bundled in furs and tucked tightly against their mothers, both for warmth and convenience. Small children were sandwiched between adults, not out of affection, but because they were heat efficient. Elders usually got the warmest corner of the bed platform, not because they were fragile, but because they were valuable. Old Vikings meant experience, wisdom, and most importantly, the best gossip and the warmest cloaks. Romance? Not tonight. If you're wondering how Viking couples found intimacy in this human and animal-packed house, let's just say, very quietly and very, very carefully. You didn't have doors. You had curtains, maybe. Or just mutual understanding that what happened under the third fur on the left side of the platform wasn't anyone else's business, but privacy. Nah, even the goat probably judged you. Did they sleep well? Not really. There was snoring, there were coughs, there were creaking boards, shifting animals, people waking to stoke the fire, and the constant threat of someone accidentally rolling over into the cooking pot. But despite all that, they got rest, because they had to. And in the morning, they'd wake up stiff, sore, and grateful they weren't frozen solid, which, in Viking terms, meant it was going to be a great day. Welcome to Viking couture, where every outfit is handmade, lumpy, slightly damp, and guaranteed to itch in places you didn't know existed. In Viking times, what you wore wasn't about style. It was about not dying, and also about hiding the fact that you hadn't bathed in 6 weeks. Start with wool, end with more wool. The base of every Viking outfit was one thing. Wool, wool, undertunic wool, overtunic wool, trousers, wool cloak wool, socks, wool hat basically. If it wasn't wool, it was probably leather or frozen. But here's the thing about wool, especially 9th century homespun wool. It was warm, it was durable, and it was so itchy, you considered making a deal with Odin just to wear something smoother. Layering wasn't a trend, it was survival. You didn't wear 1 tunic, you wore 3. You didn't put on a cloak, you wrapped it, tied it, tucked it, and hoped it stayed on when the wind punched you in the kidneys. Layers trapped warmth, shielded against wind, and caught the occasional flea trying to make a run for it. The rule was simple. If you weren't sweating by noon, you were underdressed. Underwear, kinda. Forget cotton boxers or silk anything. The closest thing to underwear was a linen loincloth, if you had linen. Most didn't. Some Vikings wore tight-fitting wool shorts or nothing at all beneath their tunics, which made communal sleeping arrangements even more personal. Accessories for the cold and brave belts were essential. They held your tools, knife, and dignity together. Leg wraps were long strips of wool wound around the calves for warmth and ankle support. Shoes were leather, thin-soled, and deeply unprepared for Scandinavian ice. Most wore felt or fur liners just to keep their toes. Some even stuffed their boots with hay. That's right, actual hay. Because when wool fails, barn flooring saves the day. Hats, hoods, and please cover my ears, head coverings were crucial. Heat escapes from your head, and the Vikings knew it. Common choices: wool caps, fur-trimmed, hoods, cowls, made from fabric thick enough to stop a small arrow. If you went outside without headgear, you were either a fool, in a hurry, or trying to impress someone you shouldn't be trying to impress in sub-zero weather. And then, the lice. Let's talk hygiene, briefly. Sadly, clothes weren't washed often, because soap was precious, water was freezing, and drying clothes took days. So yes, lice happened, often. Some Vikings used bone combs to pick them out. Others just scratched and dealt with it. That wool tunic you've worn since autumn. It's warm, it's heavy. It's home to a thriving micro-ecosystem of things that would horrify a dermatologist. Still, they made it work. Viking clothes weren't glamorous. They weren't soft. But they were practical, handmade, and often decorated with runes, beads, or colored trim that said, "Yes, I'm freezing, but I still look better than Eric, whose cloak is literally falling apart." Because even in an age of survival, a little flair mattered. Time to step outside the longhouse and into the frozen jaws of the Norse winter. So you're all bundled up in your woolen tunics and fur-trimmed hood. You've got hay in your boots, and a goat stared at you while you tied your leg wraps. And now you have to go outside. Outside, where the wind doesn't just blow, it cuts. Where snow isn't fluffy, it's weaponized ice dust. Where stepping in the wrong puddle means your toes become historical artifacts. Let's talk about what it took to face the Viking outdoors without immediately turning into a meat popsicle. Outdoor gear, not optional. Going outside wasn't a leisure activity. It was a necessary evil to fetch firewood, relieve yourself, check on the livestock, or chase down that one chicken with a death wish. So your gear had to be ready for Snow, ice, wind, wolf tracks, and the possibility of never finding your way back in the fog. The cloak, the Viking super blanket. The Viking cloak was your first and most important shield. Woolen, heavy, sometimes fur-lined. If you were lucky or raided a stylish monastery, it was clasped at the shoulder with a brooch and doubled as a blanket, a towel, a sleeping bag, a shield, a privacy curtain, and probably a cradle in a pinch. You didn't just wear your cloak, you lived inside it. If you lost it in a storm, you didn't go looking for it. You said a prayer, cursed loudly, and began writing your own saga of slow, noble frostbite. Animal intestines, fur, and other survival fabrics. Let's talk water resistance, or the lack of it. There were no Gore-Tex jackets or synthetic boot liners. Instead, the Vikings turned to nature's finest water repellers: sealskin, sheepskin, deerhide, and yes, intestines. That's right. Cleaned, stretched, and stitched. Animal intestines made surprisingly good waterproof layers. Lightweight, flexible. Just don't think about where it came from while it's rubbing against your thighs. Hands and feet. To constant emergencies, mittens were made of wool, felt, or fur, often worn over leather gloves for double insulation. Feet, a nightmare. Leather boots got soaked, so you stuffed them with hay fur, scraps, moss, desperation. Some Vikings even wrapped their feet in strips of wool or animal hide. Viking-style socks, layered like they were wrapping up a roast. Still, frostbite was common. If you made it through a winter with all your toes, you either had good boots or terrifying luck. Vision, minimal. Breathing, optional. Your hood covered your face. Your breath froze in your beard. Snow blew sideways into your eyes like a bored Norse god was trying to delete your vision. If you wore a face covering, it was usually a woolen scarf wrapped around your mouth and nose. But eventually, you had to choose between freezing your face or fogging up your only line of sight and walking into a tree. Pick your battle. Either way, the tree wins. What about the warriors? If you were a Viking warrior heading out for battle or patrol during winter, you added metal, fur, and prayers to your outfit. Helmets got cold fast, so some wore wool caps beneath them. Chainmail was brutal in the cold. It didn't insulate, it chilled. So you layered tunics under it like a very violent onion. Swords were slung over thick cloaks, and shields sometimes got wrapped in cloth to stop them from freezing to your hand. Because nothing says tough Viking warrior like trying to pry your own fingers off your axe handle. Still think you could handle it? Great. Now go relieve yourself in an outdoor pit latrine during a snowstorm. Let's eat, or at least attempt to survive, on food that tastes like hardship and regrets. You're cold, you're itchy, you're surrounded by snoring relatives and animals with poor hygiene. So surely there's comfort to be found in Viking food, right? Wrong. Because Viking cuisine in winter wasn't about joy. It was about calories, fermentation, and not starving before spring. What's for dinner? Barley. Again, the foundation of the Viking diet was grain, mostly barley, and sometimes rye or oats. These grains were ground into gruel, baked into dense, heavy flatbread, or boiled until they achieved the consistency of sadness. Barley gruel wasn't seasoned. It wasn't fun. It was hot, filling, and stuck to your ribs like edible insulation. Vegetables were seasonal, which meant not now. Fresh vegetables. Cute idea. But winter meant root vegetables, and even those ran out fast. Your winter produce might include turnips, onions, leeks, cabbage that had been pickled so hard it could survive the apocalypse. Anything green was either dried, pickled, or wishful thinking. Meat. Yes, if you planned ahead, Vikings loved meat. But winter was when they had to ration it. Meats were salted, smoked, dried, or buried in snow, and hoped for the best. Common winter meats included pork, mutton, fish, occasionally horse, bear, or seal. If things got really weird, and don't forget blood sausage, a winter delicacy made from actual blood. Warm, chewy, iron-rich, and not at all vegan-friendly. Dairy. If the animals weren't dead, if your cow hadn't frozen, dried up, or run away, you might get butter-curdled milk cheese. Vikings didn't have soft cheese. They had hope you don't break your tooth cheese. The power of pickling. Pickling wasn't a flavor preference. It was a life-saving technology. Everything was pickled. Fish eggs, root vegetables, possibly your enthusiasm, if it could fit in a barrel with salt, vinegar, or fermented whey, it became part of the Viking pantry. Taste, irrelevant. Shelf life, eternal. Fruit, technically, yes. In summer, Vikings dried berries. In winter, those berries came out like tiny sour pebbles, added to porridge, or eaten as a reminder that joy once existed. Apples might be stored in cool places. If they lasted, they were a treat. If they rotted, you added them to the beer-making process and called it rustic. Eating was a group sport. Meals were eaten from shared bowls. You got a wooden spoon, a piece of bread, and whatever was hot and edible. Seating hierarchy mattered. Elders and warriors got the best spots. Younger family members got what was left, which was often lukewarm stew and a firm "don't complain." In conclusion, you would starve, not because there wasn't food, but because you're picky, you can't eat gluten, and your idea of preserved meat is a protein bar with Himalayan sea salt and cranberry extract. Vikings ate to survive the impossible, not impress their Instagram followers. Brace yourself. We're entering the realm of fermented horror, where flavor is optional and survival is mandatory. Fermented fish and regret. Viking delicacies explained Viking food was already utilitarian. But when you dig deeper into the preserved treats, things take a dark, pungent turn. Because what Vikings considered delicacies, you would consider biohazards. Let's start with the king of regret. Fermented fish, the undisputed heavyweight of Viking cuisine, was surströmming, fermented Baltic herring. Now, to be fair, modern Swedes still eat it, but the Viking version was, let's say, extra. Take a fish, ferment it, let it sit in its own bacterial brine for weeks, then open it indoors in winter. The smell alone could clear a village hall. If you weren't used to it, your eyes watered and your soul questioned your choices. But it was high in protein, long-lasting, and could be stored in a barrel until the end of the known world. You didn't eat it because it was good. You ate it because it wouldn't kill you, and that was good enough. Lutefisk, jelly with a vengeance. Next up, lutefisk, dried whitefish, rehydrated in lye. Yes, lye. The caustic, soapy stuff that strips paint. The Vikings didn't invent it, but they probably dabbled in lye-soaked culinary experiments long before it was considered even slightly edible. It looked like translucent fish pudding and had the consistency of regret. You boiled it. You ate it. You questioned your lineage. Ram testicles and blood pudding. Bon AP. Let's talk about nothing goes to waste cuisine. Ram testicles. Boiled, sliced, possibly pickled. Blood pudding. Blood plus fat, plus barley flour, stuffed into intestines, and boiled. This wasn't just common, it was beloved. Every part of the animal was used. If you didn't eat it, someone else would. If no one ate it, you were wasting food, and that was unforgivable. Sour whey soup, anyone? Dairy leftovers became strange new horrors. Sour whey was mixed with barley, onions, and herbs to create a savory curdled soup that could warm you in winter and ruin your appetite for days. If you couldn't chew it, you drank it. If you couldn't drink it, you boiled it. If you couldn't boil it, you pickled it. This was Viking logic, and it worked for them. Beverages. Just as adventurous mead gets all the glory, but Vikings drank a lot more than just honey wine. Sour beer brewed from grains and possibly herbs of questionable origin buttermilk. If it hadn't separated into weirdness and occasionally snowmelt flavored with regret, sometimes you flavored drinks with wild herbs. Sometimes you accidentally flavored them with birch bark and despair. And yet, they survived. The Vikings didn't have Michelin stars. They had frostbite and barrels full of fish fermenting beneath their beds. You'd gag, they'd feast. You'd call a doctor, they'd call it Tuesday, because for them, food wasn't about comfort. It was about calories, endurance, and bragging rights. Cheers. It's time to talk Viking hydration and the drinks that walked a fine line between warmth and gastrointestinal warfare. Picture it. You're frozen, filthy, and have just choked down a meal of pickled onions and something vaguely resembling fish jelly. Now it's time to wash it all down. But you're in 9th century Scandinavia, so water. Haha, no. Water wasn't always safe. Or there, let's get this straight. Water sources in Viking winter were either frozen, stagnant, or suspicious. Sure, there were mountain springs and clean rivers in warmer months, but in winter, the lakes were iced over, the streams were slush, the wells were questionable, and boiling water wasn't always practical, because firewood was precious, and nobody wanted to waste it on something as luxurious as safe drinking water. Mead, the crown jewel of Viking booze. The most famous Viking drink was mead, a fermented honey wine that sat somewhere between divine nectar and medieval NyQuil. It was sweet, potent, sticky, and deeply unreliable in terms of alcohol content, made from honey, water, and wild yeast. Mead was the festival drink, the ceremonial drink, and sometimes breakfast. It warmed you, it numbed your fingers, it made your uncle sing ancient battle songs while falling into the fire pit. A true Viking classic. Beer. Cloudy, flat, and functional Viking beer was brewed from barley or rye. Thick, murky, and fermented in whatever was cleanish. It wasn't bubbly, it wasn't crisp. It had chunks. The alcohol level ranged from mildly buzzed to don't operate a longship. And yes, people drank it daily, because if you had to choose between possibly dying of bacteria-laced water or a slightly sour barley ale, you'd choose the one with calories and foam. Milk. If you dared, milk was a gamble. Fresh milk in winter was rare, since many animals stopped producing or were already dinner. If you had it, it probably came from a goat, was unpasteurized, and had a shelf life of hope. More often, it was soured into buttermilk, churned into butter, curdled into something you fed to babies or drunk uncles. You didn't drink milk for pleasure. You drank it because there was nothing else. Snow, nature's beverage. Sort of, yes, you could melt snow. But snow wasn't exactly the sparkling spring water you're picturing. It might contain ash from your fire goat tracks, surprise bits of longhouse roof debris. Still, it was free, cold, and mostly clean. Vikings often melted it for cooking, brewing, or desperate sips during long outdoor tasks. But let's be honest, nobody ever looked at snowmelt and said, "Ah, yes, delicious." Herbal concoctions. Drinkable witchcraft. The Vikings were herbalists at heart. That meant teas, tisanes, and mysterious brews made from foraged roots, bark, and herbs. Some were energizing, some helped with sleep, others had side effects. There were drinks to cure headaches, ease childbirth, or fend off spirits. Did they work? Sometimes. Did they taste good? Never. In the end, you'd be dehydrated and happy about it. Modern hydration. 8 glasses a day. Electrolytes. Not here. In Viking winter, if you were lucky, you drank beer, mead, melted snow, the tears of someone who tried fermented milk for the first time, but mostly, you just powered through your thirst like a true Norse champion, light-headed, belching barley, and smelling faintly of honey. Let's pass the time, Viking style, with bone games, drunken poetry, and the occasional indoor axe juggling. You've eaten your blood stew, you're wrapped in 3 cloaks, and now you've got 16 hours of darkness to get through. No Netflix, no books, no phone, just you, your entire extended family, a smoky longhouse, and the slow, creeping madness of Scandinavian winter. What did the Vikings do to pass the time? A lot more than you'd think. And some of it involved shouting at bones. Storytelling. The original streaming service before TikTok, there were tales by firelight. Vikings were oral storytellers, and winter nights were prime time. They told heroic sagas of gods and men, myths of ice giants, shapeshifters, and fate-raiding tales with just enough embellishment to keep it interesting gossip. Because even Thor needs to know who married whom. The storyteller held power. He spun the room into silence, awe, laughter, or dread, often with nothing more than a raised eyebrow and a dramatic pause. And if the story flopped, well, back to stirring the soup. Board games, Viking edition. Yes, the Vikings played games. And no, they weren't playing Uno, their favorite, Enofativ, a complex strategy game, also called King's Table. It involved a defending king piece trying to escape a horde of attackers, played with carved wooden tokens or animal bones on a grid. It was like Viking chess. If chess were more about murder, tactics, and passive aggression. Other games included dice games, stick tossing, stone throwing, and betting on who could juggle burning logs the longest. Singing, dancing, and dramatic yelling. Long nights equals long performances. Music came from bone flutes, harps, singing bowls, or 2 people drumming on barrels until the goat begged for mercy. Dancing was less elegant, more stompy. Think, drunk stomping in wool socks while shouting about Thor's hammer. Songs ranged from religious chants, rowdy tavern songs, lullabies, and impromptu verses about how bad your neighbor's breath smelled. Crafting, carving, and fixing everything. Winter wasn't vacation, it was workshop season. By firelight, Vikings sharpened weapons, carved runes into wood or bone wove, cloth mended nets, made new tools, carved chess pieces with alarming levels of detail. Even children had tasks. Spinning yarn, untangling wool, helping stir bubbling pots of mysterious stew. Nobody sat idle. If you weren't busy, you were probably asleep or deeply suspicious. Drinking, recreational and spiritual. You didn't need a reason to open the mead, but winter gave you one anyway. Celebrations were held for midwinter ancestors. That time you found a dried apple and nobody died, or just surviving another Tuesday. These weren't polite affairs. They involved toasts to gods, boasts from warriors, long speeches, slurred songs, possibly fire. Winter feasts were chaotic, joyous, and absolutely necessary for keeping morale above freezing. Indoor sports, absolutely. Want to wrestle your cousin between the livestock and the soup pot? Go for it. Want to challenge someone to arm wrestling, stone lifting, or who can stay outside longest without blinking. Perfect. Anything to break the monotony, even if it meant mild concussions or new burn marks on the floor. And through it all, the fire burned. The longhouse fire crackled constantly, feeding warmth, light, and a sense of continuity. Because in a world where the snow howled and the gods watched, the best defense was a roaring hearth, a game of taffel, and someone halfway through a saga about an ice troll that stole someone's pants. Time to step into the shadows, where winter doesn't just freeze your body, it haunts your mind. When winter drags on for months, and the sky hasn't shown a proper sun since the harvest, strange things start to happen. You begin hearing noises in the rafters. You feel cold spots in a room that's already freezing. The wind moans like something ancient is crawling through it. And in Viking times, that wasn't just weather. That was the other world knocking. Vikings didn't just believe in spirits. They lived among them. Norse mythology wasn't a bedtime story. It was the operating manual for existence and winter. That was when the boundaries between worlds thinned. The dead could walk. The gods could visit. And if you heard something scratching at your door, you didn't open it. You lit a candle, said a prayer, and hoped it moved on. Draugr undead, with bad attitudes, meet the Draugr. Viking undead, who were basically a combination of zombie, ghost, and extremely territorial homeowner. They lived in burial mounds. They guarded treasure, and they hated visitors. According to legend, if you disturbed a Draugr's rest by stealing their sword or building a shed too close to their tomb, they'd rise from the grave and ruin your entire month. People wore protective amulets. They laid iron on graves. And when someone died, the Vikings sometimes cut a hole in the wall to carry the body out, so the spirit wouldn't remember the door and come back in. The Wild Hunt. Sky demons on parade on especially cold, stormy nights. Some Vikings believed in the Wild Hunt, a spectral procession of gods, warriors, and spirits rampaging across the sky. Led by Odin himself, the Wild Hunt brought misfortune, death, or just massive existential dread. You didn't go outside. You didn't make noise. You did not whistle into the wind, lest something whistle back. Trolls, elves, and other things you didn't mention out loud. Not all spirits were evil, but none were casual. Trolls could steal food, livestock, or children. Elves weren't cute. They were ancient, moody, and easily offended. Landvettir protected farms unless you annoyed them, in which case your crops failed and your cows gave sour milk. Even household items had spirits. There were stories of enchanted brooms. Yes, brooms. You respected everything, because everything had the potential to make your life worse. Winter madness was real. The Vikings didn't have a name for seasonal affective disorder, but they felt it. Endless, dark, poor nutrition, smoke-filled air, freezing temperatures, and isolation took a toll on the mind. People grew anxious. Some became withdrawn. Others claimed to see things in the corners of their vision, shapes in the smoke, figures in the trees, footsteps outside at night. Were they hallucinating? Or were the old gods checking in? You didn't ask. You lit another lamp and kept your back to the wall. Rituals, charms, and night warding to keep spirits at bay. Vikings used runes carved into door frames. Iron charms hung near beds. Fire kept burning through the longest nights, and sacred herbs thrown into the flame as offerings. There were songs for protection. There were sacrifices for favor. There were rules for what to do if you heard 3 knocks on the wall and no one was there. Winter was never just physical, yes, it froze your fingers, but it also chipped away at your courage. Survival meant more than cloaks and stew. It meant facing a season that felt alive, moody, and always watching. And if you cracked from the silence, fear, and shadows, you weren't weak, you were human. Even the strongest Viking warriors shivered when the wind whispered their names at night. Let's break the tension, and maybe a few ribs, with some indoor Viking chaos. The long Viking winter wasn't just darkness, danger, and existential dread. It was also very loud, because when you stuff your entire family, plus livestock, into one smoky, dimly lit house for 5 months, things happen. People get bored. People get annoyed. People start play fighting with axes and yelling about missing turnips. Welcome to the unofficial Viking Winter Games. Wrestling. The national pastime Vikings were obsessed with a traditional form of Norse wrestling. It was fast, brutal, surprisingly technical, and the cause of many bruised egos and actual noses, and in winter, it became a daily activity. Children wrestled to learn balance. Adults wrestled to show dominance. Siblings wrestled to settle deeply personal, bread-related grudges. You wanted warmth? Start grappling. Nothing heats you up faster than trying to choke out your cousin on a straw mat next to a startled pig. Fight night in the longhouse. Arguments happened. Someone took too much stew. Someone moved the goat without asking. Someone looked at someone else's wife with a little too much mead in their system. The result? Verbal jousting, sarcastic singing, occasional wooden spoon. Duels. Weapons weren't drawn casually, but shoving. That was practically a winter greeting. Insult poetry. Norse rap battles. Yes, this was real. Called flighting. Insult duels were a structured, often hilarious way to vent frustration and verbally destroy your opponent's honor. You might hear things like, "Your beard is as patchy as last year's harvest. I've seen sheep with more backbone than your war stories. Did your mother birth you in a mead barrel? Or are you always this slow?" It was part entertainment, part therapy. And if you won, eternal bragging rights. If you lost, well, you better be funny about it. Games of strength and stupidity when they weren't wrestling or flighting. Vikings invented all sorts of winter games. Who can hold a heavy rock the longest? Who can chop the most wood before passing out? Who can balance on one leg while shouting Odin's name in a snowstorm? Prizes included more chores, bruises, someone finally laughing for the first time in weeks. Children, absolutely unsupervised Viking kids, were not sheltered. They joined in the games, the chores, and the insults. By age 5, they could tend a fire, fetch water, wrestle a goat, beat you at dice. They built toys from bones and sticks, played pretend raids, and tried not to break their fingers reenacting battles. Was it safe? No. Was it educational? Absolutely. Family time, smelly, loud, and weirdly sweet at night. After the drama and the contests and the fermented fish jokes, families often curled up together around the fire. Someone would hum a song. Someone else might share a carved trinket or retell an old legend. And for a few minutes, the longhouse would fall into a strangely peaceful silence. Because, in the end, even through the discomfort, the smoke, and the snow, Vikings had something we still crave: connection, and maybe a decent bowl of soup. Grab a comb and brace yourself. It's time for the cleanest part of Viking survival, which is still pretty dirty. When you think of Vikings, you probably picture burly warriors covered in mud, blood, and poor decisions. But here's a twist. Vikings were surprisingly clean, at least by medieval standards. That said, their version of clean might still make you question your comfort zone. Saturday was bath day, no exceptions. The old Norse word for Saturday, lagerdagur, literally, bath day. That's right. The Vikings had a weekly bathing tradition. They heated water, stripped down, and scrubbed with soap made from animal fat and ash, sometimes mixed with herbs or sand for extra exfoliation. Bath day was social important, slightly chaotic, and not optional Miss Bath Day, and people noticed. Communal bathing, bonding through steam in larger communities. Vikings used steam baths or primitive saunas. Think enclosed huts, hot stones, buckets of water, a bunch of semi-naked sweaty Norse people sitting together pretending it wasn't awkward. You'd steam, rinse, and maybe rub down with a strigil, a curved blade used to scrape off grime and dead skin, like a spa, that could also double as battlefield prep. Hair, beards, and bone combs. Vikings cared a lot about their hair and beards. Like, a lot. They braided it, oiled it, trimmed it, styled it to intimidate enemies and impress potential lovers. And they carried bone combs everywhere, often intricately carved and tucked into belts, not as fashion, but as daily tools. Combing wasn't optional, because with long winters, animal proximity, and woolen everything, there was a constant threat. Lice, the uninvited winter guest. Despite their grooming habits, lice were a problem. So Vikings combed constantly. They washed their clothes, they boiled garments when possible, and they occasionally shaved heads just to reset the infestation timer. Having lice didn't mean you were dirty. It meant you were alive and wearing clothes. Teeth, surprisingly decent. They didn't have toothbrushes, but they did. Rinse with water or herbal infusions. Use twigs as makeshift brushes. Chew on resin to clean their teeth. Viking skeletal remains show decent dental health, thanks to low-sugar diets and lots of chewing. That said, if you got a toothache, let's just say plucking was still on the table, and anesthetics were not. Toilets, a cold, lonely adventure. Bathroom breaks, a journey. Most longhouses had a latrine trench, an outdoor pit, often surrounded by a fence or a pile of regrets. You had to leave the warm house, walk through snow, squat over a dark hole, and pray the goat didn't follow you. There were no seats, no paper, just moss, straw, or smooth sticks. Choose your adventure. Clothing washed, dignity rarely. Washing clothes was tough in winter. You needed water soap space to dry things, so most people wore layers. Let outer clothes air out and changed their undergarments more often than tunics. Laundry was often done during milder spells and large-scale washing. A community effort full of complaints, steam, and passive-aggressive humming. So were Vikings dirty compared to modern hygiene? Yes, but compared to everyone else in medieval Europe, the Vikings were basically spa influencers. They believed in cleanliness, grooming, and bathing, not just for health, but as a matter of pride and honor. Even the grimiest warrior had a comb, a plan, and a ritual. Time to go dark, literally, because in the heart of Viking winter, the sun doesn't rise, and neither does your will to do anything productive. Imagine waking up and it's dark. You eat breakfast in the dark. You tend the animals in dim twilight. You eat dinner still in the dark. Then you go to sleep under firelight and repeat. Welcome to December in Viking Scandinavia, where daylight lasts about as long as your patience with fermented fish. How dark are we talking? In parts of Viking territory, especially Iceland and Norway, winter daylight could shrink to 3 to 4 hours per day, and even then, daylight was generous. It looked more like dim blue haze, low-angle sun that never rises past the trees. Shadows pretending to be light. By the time you'd finished breakfast, the day was over. What did this do to people? The darkness didn't just affect visibility, it affected everything. Mood swings were common, sleep cycles fell apart, motivation vanished faster than warm stew. People described feeling heavy, clouded, or just permanently tired. Some historians believe this seasonal slowdown led to the Norse cultural habit of planning raids and voyages in spring, summer, slowing down in winter, and leaning into storytelling, crafting, and feasting instead of farming or warfare. Winter was a hibernation of the soul, not just the body. Firelight, the original sun, to combat the dark. Vikings relied on central longhouse fires, oil lamps made from clay or carved soapstone candles, open hearths where the smoke choked you slightly less than the cold wood. These lights cast flickering shadows on the walls, creating an eerie but cozy atmosphere, perfect for myths, gossip, and maybe a ghost story or two. Adjusting sleep, the two-nap life. Without artificial light, people adapted a two-phase sleep cycle. First sleep after sunset, awake for a couple hours around midnight. Second sleep until dawn during the midnight waking. People tended the fire, checked animals, prayed or meditated, told quiet stories, or spent time with each other in hushed, intimate ways. It wasn't insomnia. It was just Viking midnight. Timekeeping was primitive, but it worked. No clocks, no watches, no sundials. Time was marked by meals, chores, fire logs, burning down the gradual rotation of the stars. If someone said, "We'll meet when the fire's half out and the goats stopped snoring," you knew exactly what they meant. Psychological coping mechanisms. Vikings had spiritual and social ways to deal with the gloom, honoring ancestors and gods with winter rituals, holding midwinter feasts to brighten spirits, sharing fireside laughter, even if it was fueled by mead and madness. In some sagas, the darkness was viewed not just as a curse, but as a sacred, inward time, a pause, a waiting, a test of endurance and faith. Could you handle it without electric lights, without coffee, without even a podcast to keep you company while checking the goats? You'd probably spend the first 3 days crying softly, tripping over firewood, and writing passive-aggressive poetry in the snow. But the Vikings, they took the darkness, sat with it, and turned it into stories. Grab your cloak and your appetite. It's time to eat, drink, and try not to burn the longhouse down. The Viking winter was long, cold, and bleak. But once the darkness reached its deepest point, midwinter, it was time to flip the script. This was Yule, a sacred, rowdy, sometimes chaotic festival that combined ancient Norse tradition, pre-Christian ritual food, fire, laughter, and enough alcohol to challenge your gods. What was Yule? Long before Christmas invaded December, the Norse celebrated, pronounced Yule, and dedicated to gods like Odin and Thor. It marked the winter solstice, the return of the sun, the hope for survival until spring. It was both a religious festival and an excuse to party like the cows were watching. How long did it last? Depending on where you lived, Yule could last 12 nights, several weeks, or as long as you had mead, meat, and moderately healthy guests feasting, drinking, gift-giving, storytelling, animal sacrifices. It was all fair game, because winter wasn't going away. But for a little while, you could forget that. The feast, a culinary comeback. Food that had been rationed for weeks now came out in force. Roasted meats, barley bread, dried berries, nuts, root vegetables, and special Yule ale brewed for the occasion for once. Nobody judged how much you ate unless you didn't share. The feast was held in the longhouse, around the fire, often communal and messy. There were no formal place settings. There was just food, firelight, and maybe a chicken hopping around someone's lap. Sacrifices, spirits, and superstition. Yule wasn't all comfort food and drunken toasts. It was a holy time, and that meant offerings to the gods, toasts to ancestors, sacred fires, and symbolic sacrifices. Sometimes of animals, sometimes of whatever you could spare. You honored Odin, asked for Freyr's favor, and maybe begged Thor to bring fewer storms next year. There were also ritual blessings, of tools, of the longhouse, of the livestock, and, occasionally, of that one cousin who kept catching fire during celebrations. The Wild Hunt returns. Remember the Wild Hunt from Part 11. Yule was peak season for it. On stormy nights, people claimed to hear hoofbeats in the sky, Odin and his ghostly riders tearing through the air in search of lost souls. If you heard them, you stayed inside. You didn't look out the window. You muttered something respectful and pretended to be asleep. Fire, music, and drunken declarations. Yule nights meant singing around the hearth, retelling sagas, playing music on lyres, drums, or empty mead jugs, and loudly vowing to conquer distant lands. There were games, drinking contests, and dance circles that somehow always included livestock. By the fourth mug of ale, even the shyest Viking could be found, reciting poetry, flirting terribly, or wrestling a cousin in honor of Thor. Did it actually help? Yes, Yule broke the psychological grip of winter. It gave people laughter, hope, warmth, and a moment to feel human again. Because when survival is your full-time job, you need a holiday that reminds you you're still alive and slightly drunk. Get ready to cozy up with your cows, goats, pigs, and a few judgmental chickens, because Viking winter wasn't just a family affair. It was a full-on barn party. Picture it. You've finally gotten comfortable under your itchy wool blankets. The fire is crackling. Your cousin stopped snoring. The darkness is almost peaceful. Then something moves 2 feet from your face. Welcome to the Viking Longhouse, where animals didn't just visit, they lived with you. Why bring the barn indoors? Simple. Survival. Winter in Viking lands was brutal for both humans and animals. So instead of keeping livestock in separate buildings, many families did what any sensible freezing civilization would do. They invited the animals inside. The longhouse was often split, one side for the family, the other side for the goats, pigs, chickens, and maybe a dairy cow named Hilda. Sometimes there was a raised wooden platform for the humans, and a dirt floor for the animals, separated by a half wall, or, more often, just wishful thinking. The benefits. It sounds chaotic, and it was. But this arrangement came with perks. Body heat. A cow could raise the temperature of the house noticeably. Protection. Animals were safer from wolves, bandits, or frostbite indoors. Convenience. You didn't have to trudge outside to milk the goat in a snowstorm. Basically, you traded personal space and smell for warmth and breakfast. The downsides. Everything else. Let's not romanticize it too much. Living with animals meant constant noise. Smells that ranged from earthy to eye-watering. Accidents that ended up on your shoes, your cloak, or your dreams. Chickens sleeping in weird places, like your boots or your soup pot. Privacy, gone. Sanity, questionable. The line between pet and pillow, very blurry. Goats, loud, mischievous, and slightly evil goats, were common indoor companions. They gave milk, they ate scraps, they screamed into the void at random hours of the night. If something in your house was broken, missing, or inexplicably covered in saliva, chances are a goat was responsible. But you tolerated it, because goat cheese was life, and their warm bodies kept your feet from freezing. Chickens, the feathered menace. Chickens were both useful and deeply disrespectful. They laid eggs, sure, but they also pooped on everything, crowed at odd hours, stared at you with judgment while you tried to enjoy your fish gruel. Vikings didn't keep chickens in cages. They wandered, they perched, they got into your grain stash and acted offended when caught. Cows and pigs, the big roommates. Cows were the VIPs of the livestock world. They provided milk, cheese, future meals, and warmth that no fur cloak could match. Pigs, meanwhile, were the troublemakers, loud, stubborn, occasionally smarter than your uncle. But both were valuable, respected, and tolerated indoors, as long as they didn't try to eat your boots. Animal chores never stopped. Even with everyone under one roof, you still had to feed them, muck their corners, milk them, yell at them when they knocked over your torch. Children were often assigned animal duty. It built character and allergies. You'd complain. They'd sleep through it. You, the modern human, would break within 48 hours. The smell, the noise, the hoof prints on your only tunic. But the Vikings, they snored right through the bleeding. They knew every animal by name. And if a chicken curled up on your chest, you let it, because heat is heat. Get ready for a slumber party, Viking style, where bedtime meant noise, cold toes, and very questionable personal boundaries. Modern people romanticize the past. They picture Vikings snuggled under cozy furs, drifting off beside a crackling fire, with the northern lights twinkling outside. Here's the truth. Viking sleep was more like a team-building exercise in extreme discomfort. One room, many people, no privacy. The Viking longhouse was basically a one-bedroom open plan, with no doors, no insulation, and zero personal space. Everyone, parents, kids, elders, sometimes guests, slept in the same room, side by side, shoulder to shoulder, often on benches, mats, or directly on straw-covered floors. There were no bedrooms, just your corner of the bench, and don't roll into the fire. Bedding, functional, not fluffy. Your mattress was straw-stuffed into a sack. Wool blankets, furs from animals that were maybe still in the house watching you sleep. You slept fully dressed, not for modesty, but because changing meant being cold, and being cold meant being dead. Night noises, a full orchestra of chaos. The Viking night was not silent. You had crackling firewood, snoring, coughing, relatives, squeaky animals, babies crying, goats chewing loudly on something important, and above it all, the wind howling like a ghost with unfinished business. Lighting, barely there. Once the fire dimmed and oil lamps were snuffed, true darkness set in. No glow from the phone, no light under the door, just pitch-black silence, punctuated by someone farting under a wool blanket. If you had to get up in the night, you hoped you didn't step on a chicken. Or worse, someone's grandmother. Temperature, constant negotiation. The fire kept the center warm, the edges of the house not so much. So you layered a wool tunic, a second tunic, a fur, a sibling. and maybe a friendly pig. Sometimes the cold still crept in, numbing toes and making your nose freeze mid-breath. The two-sleep pattern, up at midnight. Like we covered before, Vikings often practiced segmented sleep. First sleep at sundown, waking period around midnight. Second sleep until morning twilight. During that waking period, people stoked the fire, whispered, made offerings to ancestors, or handled certain romantic chores under furs. This wasn't insomnia, it was normal. Vikings didn't fight the night, they worked with it. Did they sleep well? By our standards? Absolutely not. But they were used to it. Their bodies adjusted. Their lives didn't require 8 hours of uninterrupted REM cycles. They didn't have mattresses or white noise machines. They had each other, and fur. Lots of fur. You'd last half a night before begging for a hotel room and earplugs. Time to explore the inner Viking, the one who didn't break down over cold stew or cramped living. Because in the North, mental grit was survival. It wasn't just their muscles, weapons, or wild beards that made Vikings tough. It was their mindset, their ability to handle darkness, discomfort, and despair without losing their cool. You see, Viking endurance wasn't just about physical survival. It was about emotional resilience, a deep-rooted, often unspoken determination to keep going, even when everything felt impossible. Life was hard. That was the baseline. From the day you were born into a smoky longhouse, you were expected to work. You were expected to endure. You were expected to carry your weight, even if that meant hauling firewood as a toddler. There was no fantasy of retirement. There was no treat-yourself culture. There was just get through the day and then get through the next one. Complaining. Rare, because everyone else was suffering too, and they still had to milk the goat. Stoicism as culture. Modern people go to therapy. Vikings told stories, sang sagas, and bit their tongues until spring. Their culture valued silence over whining, action over emotion, sacrifice over self-pity. Even their gods, like Odin, suffered without complaint. He hung himself on the world tree for knowledge. Thor lost battles. Frey lost love. The message: pain was part of life. Strength meant facing it head. Humor in hardship. That said, they weren't robots. The sagas are full of jokes, sarcasm, dry observations about how terrible everything is. They laughed at misfortune. They mocked death. They made up songs about flatulence, goats, and bad cooking, because sometimes that's all you could do. Laughter wasn't weakness. It was a shield against despair. Bonding through struggle. In Viking society, everyone pitched in. Men, women, children, elders. There was no going it alone. You ate together, slept together, worked together, and mourned together. That constant closeness wasn't always pleasant, but it built deep bonds, the kind forged in fire, frost, and fermented fish fumes. Even if you hated your cousin, if they were out chopping wood and didn't come back, you noticed, you cared. Faith helped. The Norse belief system wasn't exactly hopeful, but it gave meaning to suffering. Vikings didn't expect paradise. Even the bravest warriors went to Valhalla, where they fought every day and died gloriously, only to be revived to do it again. It wasn't comfort, it was purpose. Their myths didn't promise peace. They promised that even in pain, your story mattered. And that kept people going. The art of pushing through. Did people crack under pressure? Of course. Did people fall into despair? Certainly. But they didn't give up easily. They carved runes into bone. They told stories of ancestors who survived worse. They hoped spring would come, even if they didn't live to see it. Because, in the Viking worldview, endurance was everything. It didn't have to be pretty, it just had to last. Because just when you think they've hit their limit, the Vikings throw another party involving ale, fire, and at least one awkward poem. Time to raise your mug, light a fire, and try not to fall into it. Because Viking winter wasn't all gloom and grit. Sometimes it was absolute chaotic joy. Just when the cold should have broken them, the Vikings partied harder. They didn't just survive the dark months, they defied them. Through festivals, songs, weird rituals, and probably dangerous levels of ale consumption, they found light in the dark. And no event captured that Viking madness better than Yule. Wait, didn't we already do Yule? Yes, but this is the other half. Earlier, we talked about the religious rituals and family feasts. Now we dive into the unhinged, often hilarious traditions that kept people sane when nothing else could. Because Yule wasn't just sacred, it was rowdy, messy, and occasionally goat-based. The Yule log. Before, it was a decorative dessert. The Yule log was a massive chunk of wood, burned continuously through the darkest nights, said to protect the house, honor the gods, and bring luck if it lasted the full festival. If it went out early, bad omen. So families kept it smoldering, fed it carefully, and maybe argued about whose job it was when it sputtered at 2 a.m. The Yule goat, fear or fun. Modern Scandinavia has the cute straw Yule goat. Vikings, they had something far more unsettling. The Jule book was a person dressed as a goat, often with real horns and fur, who burst into homes during Yule to demand food or drink, perform loud songs or skits, make everyone deeply uncomfortable. You were supposed to treat them well, feed them, and maybe give them ale. Why? Because they might represent Thor's goats, who pulled his chariot and could be eaten, resurrected, and eaten again. Festive. Gift. Forget PlayStations and perfume. Viking Yule gifts were warm socks, sharpened tools, handmade combs, maybe a carved charm to keep spirits away. Nothing flashy, everything useful. A well-made knife or fur-lined mittens, absolute luxury. Drinking games, but medieval. We don't know the exact rules, but Viking drinking contests were intense. Mead and ale flowed freely, and men made toasts to the gods, oaths for the coming year. Long, slurred declarations of love, ambition, or vengeance. And if someone spilled their cup, shame. If someone passed out, mid-speech, laughter, then concern, then more laughter. Poetry and performance. Even drunk Vikings loved poetry. Skalds would perform elaborate verse, often on the spot, recounting battles, gods, the roast pig you were currently eating. If you were particularly bold, you might try a verse or two yourself. Good poems earned admiration. Bad ones earned heckling. Great ones might just earn you a second helping of meat. And then came the madness. As Yule stretched on, the parties often blurred the line between celebration and endurance trial. You had people dancing in heavy furs, singing competitions that turned into wrestling matches, loud debates about which god was strongest, and the occasional guest falling into the fire pit. It wasn't chaos for chaos' sake. It was release. A way to fight back against winter with the loudest, weirdest joy possible. When it was over, once Yule ended, the house got quiet again. The guests left. The The goat costume went back in the corner. The fire crackled low, and people returned to the rhythm of waiting, surviving, and hoping for spring. But the echo of laughter and songs lingered, because, in Viking times, joy wasn't a luxury, it was a survival tool. Let's wrap it up. One final snow-covered truth bomb. Let's bring it home, through the frost, the fire, and the fierce will to survive. So now you've seen it all. The cold, the longhouse, the lice, the goats, the fermented fish, the endless dark, the shouting, the joy, the despair, and the songs. And you're probably thinking, I wouldn't make it 24 hours. And you're right. Why, you'd tap out by morning. You, the modern human, love heating systems, refrigerators, fleece blankets, personal space, door locks, 8 hours of silence, and lavender-scented diffusers. In Viking winter, you get a smoky fire that kind of warms the goat, one blanket, a floor that leaks cold into your spine, people snoring, talking, sneezing, and occasionally sleep fighting, mystery stew 3 times a day, 0 privacy, and a chicken watching you bathe with snow. It's not just discomfort, it's the complete collapse of every convenience you've ever known. You wouldn't last, not because you're soft, but because they were forged different. Why they endured. The Vikings didn't have a choice, but more than that, they weren't waiting for the cold to go away. They lived with it. They wrapped themselves in wool, faith, stories, and each other. They endured smoke. They sang through hunger. They found meaning in struggle, not despite it, but because of it. They knew suffering was inevitable, but how you suffered, that was up to you. They had strength we forget we need, the kind of strength that chops firewood for someone else's fire, hugs a coughing child close under fur, pours the last mug of ale into someone else's bowl, sleeps next to a dying goat because you promised you'd keep it warm. They were rough, sure, but they were tender in ways we overlook, not soft, but loyal, not loud, but steady, not fearless, but resilient. In the end, it was never about one day. You wouldn't last a day because Viking life wasn't meant to be done alone. It wasn't meant to be sampled like a tourist. It was a lifetime of becoming the kind of person who could laugh in the dark and share in the leanest season. They didn't survive by accident. They survived by holding the line together. So no, you wouldn't last a day. But maybe, if you were born among them, if you were raised with stories by firelight, with your feet in snow and your heart in the gods, with strength that grew in silence and hardship and care, maybe you would, just maybe, you'd be the one telling the story by the hearth and not the one crying into the soup. Winter didn't defeat the Vikings, it defined them. And that's why, all these centuries later, their stories, like the embers of their fires, still burn.